My dad announced at dinner that I'd never amount to anything. I let him finish, then showed everyone my net worth. The dining room glowed under the expensive chandelier he'd installed, not for its light, but for the way it refracted his ego across the polished mahogany table. Cutlery clinked against porcelain in practiced rhythm as if rehearsed for a performance none of us had known we were attending. Every chair was occupied, every plate stacked with roast beef, scalloped potatoes, and the same stale hierarchy that had suffocated me since adolescence. My father sat at the head, naturally, swathed in a navy blazer that still bore the tailor's crease lines like fresh scars of affluence. He adjusted his cufflinks, gold, gaudy, and absurdly ostentatious, and raised his tea glass in a slow, deliberate arc. He cleared his throat with a theatrical rasp, commanding silence not through authority, but through the sheer gravity of self-importance. The kind of pause that foreshadowed either a toast or a tirade, and with him they were often indistinguishable. "Some kids," he began, voice soaked in Cabernet and contempt, "make you proud." The air grew taut. He smirked, looked around as if his audience had just applauded, and he let the words dangle like a noose. "Well, they never amount to anything." The laughter that followed was cruel in its precision, sharp, rehearsed, meant to land like a knife between my ribs. The clinking resumed, nervously, as relatives exchanged sidelong glances, unsure whether to join the ridicule or shrink from its shadow. He leaned back, satisfied, sipping his mocktail like a monarch, savoring the blood of a peasant rebellion quashed. My mother winced, not from disapproval, but from the awkward silence that followed, as though the absence of defense was more distasteful than the insult itself. I didn't speak, didn't tighten my jaw or glare back like I used to when I still craved a shred of paternal recognition. Instead, I reached into my inner coat pocket and retrieved my phone, sleek, inconspicuous, yet brimming with data more volatile than any retort. With a few practiced swipes, I activated the screen mirror to the massive OLED display that adorned the wall behind him. The television flickered from muted landscape art to the cold, irrefutable glow of digits and documents. The first slide appeared, a high-resolution scan of my bank statement. Commas in the right places. A string of zeros stretching out like a procession of proof. Gasps echoed like falling dominoes. My cousin, the one who once called me a wannabe YouTuber, actually dropped her fork. The next image followed. A brand partnership deal with a tech conglomerate so influential that even his stockbroker would have stammered through its mention. My name was listed at the top, next to words like executive consultant and equity share. Then came the valuation of my media company. Not just numbers this time, but charts, forecasts, industry articles quoting my predictions with reverence usually reserved for economists and prophets. His smirk faltered. Barely, but enough. The tea glass stopped midair, fingers clenching slightly around the stem like it might shatter if the truth weighed any heavier. But I wasn't done. The final slide emerged, an article from Forbes, my name glowing in bold, the headline unapologetically grand. The visionary behind the curtain, how one creator revolutionized digital engagement. A photo of me, confident and sharp in tailored black, sat above paragraphs of praise from industry titans who once would have turned their noses up like he always had. The silence was pure, pristine, almost sacred in its obliteration of every slight, every rolled eye, every snide remark muttered in golf club lounges or whispered during holiday parties, where I'd been treated like a tolerated embarrassment. He stared at the screen, and his expression held no words, just the dawning horror of a man who realized the house he built was no longer big enough to contain the empire I'd forged on my own. I rose from my chair, with the deliberate calm of someone who no longer needed to raise his voice to be heard. My gaze swept the room, not with vengeance, not with spite, but with the serene authority of someone who had finally outgrown the small cage built for him. Every pair of eyes remained on me, wide, blinking, recalibrating. "Turns out I amounted to something," I said, my tone unhurried and smooth as velvet drawn across iron. "And I did it without your approval." No one dared move, not even him. I turned, letting the sound of my footsteps echo against the marble tile like a drumbeat of finality. The air behind me was thick, not just with the scent of expensive meat and resentment, but with the undeniable shift in gravity. He was no longer the sun around which this dysfunctional solar system revolved. I walked away, not in defiance, but in conclusion, like a chapter closed not with ink, but with triumph. And behind me I left not a son defeated, but a patriarch dethroned. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, the last echo of my departure reverberating through the bone-lined cathedral of his pride. Outside, the night was crisp, the kind of early winter cold that bites just enough to remind you you're alive. My breath coiled in the air like smoke from a smoldering fire, lingering, dissipating, vanishing. I didn't look back, not because I feared his reaction, but because I knew for the first time it didn't matter. Still, I didn't leave the estate. Not yet. My car sat idling beneath the wrought iron archway where the family crest gleamed under the moonlight like a relic from a forgotten empire. I leaned against the hood, hands in my pockets, eyes on the mansion's upper windows. Through one of them, faint silhouettes passed, curtains stirring, shadows of a family caught in the aftershock of revelation. The same relatives who once mocked me for living in a studio apartment above a laundromat were now digesting filet mignon with a side of humble pie. Inside, the dinner table remained as I left it, abandoned mid-meal, the food cooling, the air stagnant with things unsaid. My father hadn't moved. He was still in his chair, elbows on the table, hands clasped before his face like a man in prayer or panic. The television still flickered silently behind him, now looping back to the cover of Forbes. My name glowed across his dining room like graffiti on a cathedral wall. It was my cousin Lindsay who finally broke the silence. "Is that real?" she whispered, voice brittle, almost apologetic. No one answered. My uncle cleared his throat, ever the opportunist. "I always said he was smart, remember? He was always on that laptop, doing whatever he was doing." My aunt scoffed. "You called it a waste of electricity just last Christmas." "She did," said another, not looking up. "Can someone turn that thing off?" barked my father suddenly, voice cracking in its own command. No one moved. "Turn it off!" he shouted again, but the TV ignored him, indifferent as truth always is to tantrums. It was my mother who reached for the remote and finally blanked the screen, plunging the room into a silence that was not peace, but the absence of ammunition. She looked at her husband then, really looked at him, this man who had once stood on pedestals of certainty, who now looked small, even in his tailored suit and silver cufflinks. There was no anger in her expression, just a quiet, almost clinical disappointment. "You always said he'd be nothing," she said, voice low but cutting, "and you said it so often you started to believe it yourself." He didn't answer. She set the remote down gently beside her cocktail glass, then folded her napkin with precision, each corner aligned like she was sealing an old letter she'd never send. She didn't look at him again. Upstairs, my younger brother Marcus watched from the landing. He hadn't come down when dinner was called, said he had a project, probably another excuse to avoid the storm, but he'd seen everything through the railing. Now he sat on the top stair, scrolling through the same article I'd shown, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. He had followed me once, looked up to me, until our father's voice had worn him down into mimicry. But that seed of admiration had never died, just buried under years of second-hand scorn. Back outside, I finally pushed off the hood of my car and got in. The leather seats were warm, familiar, the dashboard blinking softly with notifications, emails, alerts, more numbers. My world, built from pixels and persistence, still turning while the dinner table decayed in confusion. I pulled away slowly, letting the tires roll across the gravel with patient defiance. The estate faded in the rearview mirror, the sprawling house no longer a monument, but a mausoleum of outdated judgments. My phone buzzed, and I glanced down. A message from Marcus. "Can I call you later? I want to learn what you do. For real." I smiled, not because I needed his validation, but because he'd asked. On his own. Without fear this time. Back inside, my father stood, slowly, as if rising from wreckage instead of a chair. The guests watched, unsure if he'd erupt or crumble. He adjusted his blazer, smoothing the fabric like it might erase what had happened. "I don't care how much money he's made," he muttered. "Money doesn't mean success. Not real success." No one responded. "I raised him better than this," he added, louder this time, addressing the room like a courtroom. "Better than what?" asked my mother, not looking up. "Better than proving you wrong?" His jaw clenched. "He should have told us," he said. the last thread of pride unraveling. Should have done it right. The family way. Lindsay laughed then, not kindly, but with the brittle edge of a dam breaking. The family way? You mean pretending we're better than everyone else while living in denial? He showed us proof, Uncle. You showed us speeches. My father didn't speak again, just stood there, staring at the chair where I had sat, like maybe if he glared long enough, the image of me there would be replaced by the son he imagined, the obedient one, the one who never existed. Later, long after the guests left and the plates were cold, he sat alone in that same chair, staring at the blank TV, his fingers idly turning the remote over and over in his hand like a relic of power that no longer obeyed him. And upstairs, in a dark room now lit only by a laptop screen, Marcus opened a blank document titled New Project and began to type. 3 weeks passed. Not the kind that slip quietly into memory, but the kind that brand themselves onto the skin of a family's legacy. No Sunday dinners, no polite messages in the family group chat. The house, the estate I had once escaped like a convict with ambition for keys, stood still and untouched, its grand halls echoing only with the reverberations of that evening. No one dared speak of it directly. They tiptoed around the event, as if acknowledging it would collapse the fragile myth they had built around my father's infallibility. But time, unlike pride, does not pause to preserve illusions. Marcus came to me, not in whispers or hesitation, but with purpose. He showed up outside my building, a canvas messenger bag slung over his shoulder, his coat flapping in the wind like the wings of a fledgling finally deciding to fly. When I opened the door, he stood there with a look that blended remorse and hope into something genuine. "I've been watching your videos," he said without preamble, "reading the articles, the interviews. I had no idea what you were really building." "I know," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "You weren't supposed to." He dropped his bag on the couch and looked around, his eyes wide. The space was sleek, modern, humming with that unmistakable energy that comes from somewhere built not by inheritance but by intention. Screens displayed analytics, graphs, project notes. A whiteboard carried sketches for a new initiative. He moved like someone walking through a museum curated by the sibling he'd forgotten was an artist. "You built all this by yourself?" he asked. "No one builds anything entirely alone," I replied, grabbing 2 bottles of water. "But yeah, no shortcuts, no borrowed money, no family favors, just 10 years of people laughing, then finally listening." He nodded slowly. "I want to learn. Not just the tech, the business. I want to understand how you turned their mockery into something this strong." I handed him the bottle, and for a moment we just sat there in silence, the unspoken apology in his presence louder than any formal words could have offered. "I can teach you," I said, "but you have to let go of their voices. You can't bring the echoes of that house into this one." He understood. That much I saw in his eyes. Back at the estate, my father grew quieter by the day. He stopped walking his usual path around the perimeter gardens. No more early morning golf outings or evening calls to old business contacts who pretended not to notice the shift in his tone. He would sit by the window, swirling his drink without sipping, and stare into the garden like a general surveying a battlefield long after the war had ended. He still hadn't called me. He didn't have to. I knew what silence meant in our family. Silence was the punishment. Silence was the surrender. But this time, it wasn't inflicted. It was endured. My mother eventually broke the standstill. She appeared at my office unannounced, her hands clasped in front of her as if holding an invisible offering of peace. She looked older than I remembered, not from age, but from the weight of years spent watching pride eat her household from the inside. "He's not well," she said softly. "He won't say it, but I can see it. The bloat, it's broken something in him." "I didn't hit him," I replied, standing at the edge of my desk. I told the truth. For once. She didn't argue. She never did. That was her role, her cage, her compromise. "He's afraid you'll never forgive him," she said after a long pause, "that he waited too long to say anything that matters." I sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap. "I'm not angry anymore," I said. "I just stopped waiting for him to see me." She nodded, her eyes glossy but dry. "Would you come? Just once? He won't ask. He won't even admit it. But if you walk through that door, I think it would matter." I agreed. Not because he deserved it, but because I had outgrown the need to withhold anything out of revenge. I had proven myself, I had built my future, and sometimes the only way to truly leave the past behind is to walk through it one last time. The house felt smaller than I remembered. He was sitting in the study, the room that had once been forbidden territory unless summoned. The walls were still lined with books he had never read and awards he had demanded be mounted in perfect alignment. He didn't look up when I walked in. "I thought you'd come sooner," he said. "I didn't owe you that," I replied calmly. He nodded, as if conceding a chess match with his last piece pinned. He reached for something on the desk. A photograph, one I hadn't seen in years. Us, side by side from when I was maybe 10. I was holding a toy camera. He had his hand on my shoulder, not in pride, but in control. "I told myself I was preparing you for the real world," he said after a long pause. "That if I was hard on you, you'd toughen up, grow sharper. But I didn't see you. I saw my failures. And I hated that you didn't want to be anything like me. I let the silence sit, weighty and still. You said I'd never amount to anything," I said. "At dinner, in front of everyone. That wasn't preparation. That was humiliation." He nodded again. "I know." Another silence passed between us. But this one was different. Not cold, not empty, just honest. "I'm sorry," he finally said. I exhaled slowly. I didn't say I forgave him. I didn't pretend the wound had healed with those words, but I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Recognition. Not of my success, not of my net worth, but of me. "I'm not here for an apology," I said. "I'm here so we both know it happened, and that it ends here." He stood then, extended a hand. Not as a father, as a man offering the only gesture he knew how to give. I took it. Not because he earned it, but because I no longer needed to withhold it. Marcus and I launched the new project 2 months later, a mentorship platform for creators from backgrounds like ours. Undervalued, dismissed, underestimated. The site went viral in its first week. Investors lined up. Interviews flooded in. This time our family watched, not with skepticism, but with stunned awe. No one laughed, no one doubted, and no one tried to take credit. The last time I visited the estate, it was different. The air was lighter. The weight that had haunted the dining room seemed lifted, like dust finally swept from a forgotten mirror. My father didn't say much. He didn't need to. As I left, he called out, not loud, but clear, "I'm proud of you." And this time, I didn't need it. But I let him say it, because some victories are louder when you no longer need to win.